Morning had no color in that room. The blinds stayed half closed, and the light that slipped through looked watered down, like it was afraid to wake me. A monitor clicked and chirped in careful rhythms, and an IV pump sighed every few minutes as if it had opinions. The air smelled like disinfectant and warmed plastic. My throat felt raw, my limbs heavy, and my chest carried that strange pressure that comes from being watched by machines. I was awake, present, and still, and I waited for my family to notice the person I was, not the case file. The doctors called it stable, the kind of word that sounds comforting until you realize it can mean anything. I could sit up for a minute before nausea rolled in, and when I tried to breathe deep, my ribs argued back. Every test came with another possibility, another cautious pause, another plan that depended on numbers trending the right way. I wasn't dying in that moment, but I wasn't living normally either. I kept picturing my house keys on the kitchen counter, untouched mail, half-finished coffee, and a life waiting to resume without any promise it would ever for me. My family came in waves, not with concern, but with schedules. A chair scraped, a bag rustled, a phone buzzed, and someone always stood too close to the window as if the view could explain what to do with me. They asked the nurse questions in quick bursts, then returned to their screens like the answers were just another notification. When their eyes landed on me, it was brief, polite, and already moving on. I felt like a piece of luggage they couldn't leave unattended only because it would look bad if they did before strangers in this hospital today. They laid paperwork on the tray table like it belonged there more than my dinner. Insurance forms, discharge notes, a printed list of medications they kept revising with annoyed little sighs. I heard my name a lot, but never aimed at me. It was my name as a task, my name as a file, my name as an expense. Their whispers had that sharp edge people use when they're trying to sound kind while being impatient. I watched my oldest scroll through messages, thumbs moving fast, and wondered who they were updating because it clearly wasn't me while I lay listening. When the nurse asked how my pain felt, my sister answered before I could inhale. When the doctor asked if I'd been eating, my son nodded like he'd been the one chewing. They meant to be helpful, I'm sure, but it landed like erasure. I tried once to speak, voice thin and unsteady, and everyone turned toward me with the same expression you give a child interrupting adult business. The nurse looked apologetic, then went right back to my family, pen poised. I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted the tiny holes, steadying myself until the appointment moved on. That's when the thought arrived, quiet but absolute. I wasn't a person to them in here. I was a problem to manage, a cost, a complication. The worst part was how familiar it felt, like the hospital had simply stripped away the polite coating and revealed the old pattern underneath. I had always been the one who handled things, bills, repairs, plans, so maybe they assumed I'd handle this too, even from a bed. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I swallowed it down, refusing to give them a scene they could dismiss as stress, medication, or an overreaction later. At one point, they started talking about next steps like I wasn't the one who had to live them, who would handle my house while I was out, what to do with my car, whether my job would understand. The words weren't cruel, but they were confident, like permissions had already been granted. I wanted to ask why nobody thought I might recover, or why every plan sounded like a transfer of control. But my body felt slow, and their certainty moved faster than my strength. I listened, letting each assumption stack up, heavier than the blankets on my legs. The water cup sat untouched at my bedside, sweating into a paper ring, and it felt like a perfect summary of the day. Offered, present, ignored. My folded blanket kept sliding to one side, no matter how I shifted, and I couldn't fix it without tugging at the IV line. The clock above the door clicked loud enough to count my humiliation in seconds. Every time footsteps passed in the hallway, I hoped they were coming for me, someone who would ask what I needed, not what I owned. Instead, the door opened for charts and vitals, and time kept moving. I didn't explode. I didn't cry. I just watched, collecting details the way you collect evidence when you finally accept you might need it. Confusion came first. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they didn't know what to say. Then sadness settled in, heavy and undeniable, because fear doesn't usually look like boredom. I began to understand that my role in this family had always been quiet labor, and now that I couldn't perform it, they didn't know where to place me. That thought hurt, but it also cleared something in me, like fog lifting from a familiar road at long last. Lying there, I asked the question I dodged for years. If I vanished, would they mourn me or manage me? I pictured my home in dim light, the photo frames, the spare key, the folders I had organized long ago because I liked order and hated burdening anyone. In that bed, order felt like protection. Beyond the curtain, their voices stayed low and practical, a tone they used when making plans for things they assumed were theirs. I heard my name, then the word after, and my stomach tightened. They weren't waiting for me to get better. They were arranging it. That hospital bed did something strange to time. It slowed the present and pulled the past forward until it sat beside me, unavoidable. I wasn't thinking about test results or recovery schedules anymore. My mind kept drifting backward, not to one memory, but to a pattern. A long, quiet pattern that explained why no one in that room seemed worried about how I felt. I had been preparing them for this moment my entire life, without realizing it. Responsibility came early for me, not because someone announced it, but because situations demanded it and no one else stepped in. I learned quickly that when something needed fixing, I was expected to notice first. When something went wrong, my name came up naturally, like gravity pulling objects downward. I didn't resent it at the time. It felt good to be trusted, to be capable, to be the one people leaned on when things felt unsteady. That sense of being needed shaped me before I was old enough to question it. As the years passed, that role hardened into identity. I became the dependable one without ever applying for the position. If there was a bill that couldn't be paid on time, I covered it. If there was an argument brewing, I smoothed it over. If someone needed a place to stay, advice to follow, or money to bridge a gap, I was already reaching for my wallet before they finished explaining. I told myself this was what family did. I told myself love was proven through action, not words. The sacrifices never arrived as dramatic moments. They were small decisions made over decades, delaying things I wanted because someone else needed something urgently, saying yes when my energy said no, restructuring my finances to absorb someone else's mistake, then doing it again when the next one came along. I didn't keep track. I didn't want leverage. I didn't want anyone to feel like they owed me. I believed that generosity without conditions was the purest form of care.
Help became routine. I never asked for receipts or timelines. I didn't document anything or clarify expectations. If someone said they'd pay me back someday, I nodded and moved on. If they forgot, I let it go. I thought reminding them would cheapen the gesture. I thought love meant not counting. Over time, I trained them to believe my support was endless and automatic, something that didn't require acknowledgement because it would always be there. The family patterns settled in quietly. I solved problems, and once they were solved, everyone moved on. There was never much reflection, never a pause to ask how it affected me. Crises ended, relief followed, and the spotlight shifted elsewhere. I stayed in the background, already bracing for the next thing. When I tried to talk about my own worries, they were acknowledged briefly, then postponed. Later became a familiar word. We'll deal with that later. You're strong. You'll be fine. Let's just get through this first. Over time, emotional neglect stopped feeling like neglect and started feeling normal. No one checked in unless something was needed. No one asked what I wanted because they assumed I didn't need much. I laughed it off when people joked that I was the responsible one, the stable one, the one who always landed on their feet.
I wore it like a badge, even as it grew heavier. Being reliable became my personality, and anything beyond that felt indulgent. There were moments when my needs surfaced, usually quietly and inconveniently. A hint that I was tired, a suggestion that I needed help too. Those moments rarely went anywhere. They were met with reassurance instead of support, praise instead of action. "You're so capable. You always manage." I learned quickly that expressing need only made people uncomfortable, so I stopped doing it. I convinced myself that needing less made me easier to love. My sense of self slowly wrapped itself around usefulness. I measured my worth by how much I could carry, how smoothly I could absorb problems without complaint. Love felt tied to performance. If I was helpful, I belonged. If I faltered, I felt the distance immediately. I told myself this was adulthood, that everyone carried weight, that I was just better at it than most. The exhaustion stayed tucked away beneath pride, invisible but constant. Looking back, the warning signs were there. The way expectations grew without conversation, the way gratitude faded into assumption, the way help turned into entitlement without anyone noticing the shift. Requests stopped sounding like requests. They came with confidence, as if my agreement was already factored in. When I hesitated, even briefly, it was met with surprise, sometimes irritation. I ignored that feeling in my chest that told me something was wrong. I didn't want to believe that kindness could be misinterpreted as obligation. Lying in that hospital bed, all of it lined up with painful clarity. My family wasn't acting out of character. They were acting exactly as I had taught them to. I had spent a lifetime showing them that I could be relied on without being consulted, that my boundaries were flexible, that my presence was functional. They didn't know how to see me as vulnerable because I had never let myself be that person around them. I had confused being strong with being invisible. The hardest part wasn't remembering everything I had given. It wasn't even realizing how much I had lost along the way. It was understanding that my role had become so fixed that my humanity had faded from view. They didn't ask how I felt in that hospital room because my feelings had never been central to our dynamic. I had always been the solution, not the subject. As that realization settled in, heavier than the illness itself, something inside me shifted. What hurt wasn't that they needed me. I had accepted that long ago. What hurt was recognizing that somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing me as a person at all. The quiet in that hospital room wasn't peaceful. It wasn't the kind that lets you rest or heal. It was heavy, crowded with things left unsaid, and it pressed down on me harder than the machines ever did. Between their conversations, there were long pauses where no one looked at me. No one checked if I was still listening. No one acknowledged that I was the reason we were all there. That silence told me more about my place in their lives than any words ever had. Their conversations began to drift in a direction that had nothing to do with recovery. Logistics replaced concern. Schedules replaced questions. I heard them talking about who would handle what if I was out for a while, how responsibilities might need to be redistributed, how inconvenient the timing was for everyone involved. My condition wasn't treated like something to navigate together. It was treated like a delay, a problem to work around so things could get back on track as soon as possible. When updates came from doctors or nurses, they listened closely, but only to extract information they needed. Prognoses weren't met with relief or worry, just calculations. How long? How much? What next? If the doctor mentioned rest or limitations, I could feel the tension rise, as if my body's needs were complicating their plans. The moment medical staff stepped out, the tone shifted. Voices dropped, edges sharpened. They spoke freely then, more honestly, as if the performance of concern had ended. No one asked how I felt, not once. Not about pain, fear, or even boredom. It was as if acknowledging my inner experience would slow everything down, force a pause they didn't want to take. I started to notice how often questions were asked around me, but never to me. Decisions were discussed, revised, and finalized without my input, and I was expected to accept them simply because I was lying down while they were standing. I tested my presence in small, almost invisible ways. I shifted in the bed, letting the sheets rustle. I cleared my throat softly. I held someone's gaze a second longer than necessary, waiting for recognition. Nothing changed. Conversations continued uninterrupted. Screens stayed lit. Papers stayed spread across the table. It felt like being in a room where the soundproof glass only worked one way. I could hear everything, but nothing I did reached them. With each passing hour, the isolation deepened. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet erosion. I felt myself pulling inward, conserving energy not just physically but emotionally. The part of me that used to step in, offer solutions, smooth things over, stayed still. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for filling the gaps. I let the silence sit, and in doing so, I started to hear what it had been saying all along. Sunlight crept slowly across the wall, inch by inch, marking time more honestly than the clock. I watched it move while conversations repeated themselves in circles. Morning turned into afternoon without ceremony. Meals arrived and left untouched. No one noticed. That detail stayed with me. The way my untouched tray was cleared without comment, just another task completed efficiently. It mirrored how my presence was being handled, acknowledged only as something to manage. That's when the realization began to take shape, steady and undeniable. My value to them might not be inherent, it might be conditional, tied to what I provided, what I handled, what I absorbed. Lying there, stripped of my usual function, I wasn't sure who I was to them anymore. The thought didn't arrive with anger, it arrived with clarity, the kind that makes your chest feel hollow before it makes you feel strong. Somewhere in that quiet, my first emotional boundary formed. I didn't announce it, I didn't plan it, it simply happened. I stopped reaching for their attention. I stopped waiting for validation that wasn't coming. I began to observe instead of participate. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. I wasn't trying to be seen anymore. I was trying to understand. Acceptance followed slowly. Not acceptance of their behavior, but acceptance of the truth beneath it. Something fundamental in our relationship was broken, and it hadn't happened overnight. This hospital room had just stripped away the distractions that usually hit it. I could no longer tell myself stories about stress or misunderstanding. What I was seeing was consistent, patterned, and deeply ingrained. Then I heard my name used differently, not with concern or uncertainty, but with assumption, in a sentence about timelines, in a comment about what would happen after. It was said casually, confidently, like the outcome was already decided. In that moment, the silence finally made sense. They weren't waiting for me to recover. They were preparing for me to be handled. They mistook stillness for absence. Because my eyes were closed and my body barely moved, they assumed I wasn't listening. They assumed weakness meant unconsciousness. That single mistake changed everything, because it gave me access to a truth they never intended to share. In that moment, I wasn't just lying in a hospital bed. I was standing quietly at the edge of a room where masks had finally been set down. Their voices dropped, not out of concern, but convenience. The conversations shifted shape, becoming more deliberate, more focused. I heard words like accounts, documents, and preparation spoken with the same tone people use when organizing storage or sorting paperwork. There was no panic in their voices, no grief hovering underneath, just planning. Calm, confident, forward-looking planning that assumed my role in the future was minimal at best. What unsettled me most was the absence of malice. No one sounded angry or cruel. There was no bitterness, no resentment being aired. Instead, there was entitlement, quiet, comfortable, and unexamined. They spoke as if these discussions were long overdue, as if circumstances had finally caught up to what they believed was inevitable. That casual certainty landed harder than open hostility ever could have. The shock didn't come from what they were talking about, but from how easily the words flowed. They discussed assets the way people discuss weather patterns. Who would oversee what? What would need to be updated? What might be inconvenient if things took too long? My illness wasn't framed as something to endure or support. It was framed as an obstacle, a disruption to plans that were already mentally underway. Listening to them, I felt a strange separation from my own body. The physical discomfort, the soreness, the nausea, the constant fatigue faded into the background. Emotional betrayal took its place, sharper and more immediate. It cut through me in a way pain medication never could have dulled. I had always believed that if I ever truly needed them, they would show up differently. What I heard proved how wrong that belief had been. Memories surfaced without warning. Moments when I had stepped in without being asked. Times I had rearranged my life to make theirs easier. I remembered sitting at tables late at night, reviewing numbers, figuring out solutions that wouldn't stress anyone else. I remembered telling myself that this was what loyalty looked like, that one day it would matter. Those memories clashed violently with the reality unfolding in that room. The clarity was brutal, but clean. They didn't see themselves as beneficiaries of my generosity. They saw themselves as entitled to it. The support I had given freely over the years had been absorbed into their sense of normal. It wasn't kindness to them. It was baseline, expected, owed. That realization didn't come with rage. It came with a cold understanding that settled deep and stayed there. As they continued talking, I noticed how my name was used. Not as a person, but as a reference point, a placeholder in sentences about timing and access. They weren't discussing me, they were discussing around me. The distinction mattered. It revealed how thoroughly I had been reduced to a role, one that could be transferred, managed, and eventually closed. Something shifted inside me then. The hurt didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling the moment. In its place came clarity, clean, steady, and resolute. I stopped hoping they would notice me listening. I stopped wanting them to suddenly realize how wrong this all was. That desire for emotional validation, for recognition, quietly left me. I didn't need it anymore. I lay there, breathing shallow and slow, not because I was weak, but because I was thinking. Each sentence they spoke confirmed what I had begun to understand in earlier hours. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't stress. This was the logical outcome of a lifetime of dynamics that had never been challenged. I wasn't hearing new information. I was hearing the truth without decoration. A decision began forming, quietly and without drama. It didn't arrive as a plan or a list of steps. It was more like a line being drawn internally, firm and final. I knew I wouldn't confront them. I knew I wouldn't explain myself. I also knew that nothing I did next would be driven by anger. Anger would have meant they still had access to me. This decision belonged to me alone. As they wrapped up their conversation, satisfied and assured, I felt an unexpected calm. They believed they understood the situation completely. They believed they were prepared. What they didn't realize was how much of my life had already been shaped by foresight, by quiet preparation they had never asked about and never been invited into. As the weight of their expectations settled heavily in the room, I understood something that almost made me smile. They had no idea what I had already put in motion. What they never understood was that responsibility had taught me preparation long before it ever taught me resentment. Long before hospital rooms and whispered conversations, there were quiet evenings when I sat alone at my table, sorting through documents with no sense of urgency, only intention. It wasn't fear that drove me, it was order. A need for things to make sense, to be clear, to be handled properly so no one would ever have to guess what I wanted or scramble in my absence. Those nights weren't dramatic. There was no anger guiding my pen, no betrayal fueling my decisions. I had simply reached a point in life where I understood how quickly circumstances could change and how easily confusion could turn into conflict. I had seen it happen to others, families torn apart, not by tragedy itself, but by the mess left behind. I promised myself that wouldn't be my story. I started with organization, accounts, policies, records, everything laid out plainly, nothing hidden, nothing rushed. I reviewed each document slowly, making sure it reflected not just my assets, but my values. I wasn't thinking about punishment or reward. I was thinking about responsibility, about preventing chaos, about maintaining dignity even when I might not be able to speak for myself someday. Estate planning was something I handled alone, not because I didn't trust people, but because I trusted myself to be clear-headed. I didn't want opinions, pressure, or emotional reactions shaping decisions that needed calm logic. I consulted professionals, asked precise questions, and listened carefully. Every choice was deliberate. Every line served a purpose. I made sure nothing was left open to interpretation. Legal boundaries were set the same way I lived most of my life, quietly and firmly. I didn't announce them. I didn't threaten anyone with them. They simply existed, steady and enforceable. Trust structures were put in place to protect what I had built, not just financially, but ethically. Contingencies covered situations I hoped would never happen, but knew could. Safeguards ensured that access came with responsibility, not assumption. No one else was involved, and that was intentional. I had learned over time that privacy and secrecy are not the same thing. Secrecy hides out of fear. Privacy protects out of wisdom. What I was doing wasn't meant to surprise anyone or control anyone. It was meant to remove ambiguity, to make sure that no one could rewrite my intentions when I wasn't in a position to correct them. At the time, finishing that paperwork brought an unexpected sense of relief. Not because it closed a chapter, but because it gave me peace. I remember sealing folders, labeling envelopes, placing them carefully where they would be accessible only when necessary. There was something grounding about it, something that made me feel present and in control of my own life in a way that had nothing to do with other people's expectations. I didn't dwell on it afterward. I didn't bring it up in conversations or use it as leverage. It existed quietly in the background, like a safety net you hope you'll never need but are grateful to have. Life moved on. Responsibilities continued. The role of being reliable never left me, but beneath it there was now structure, something solid that belonged only to me. Lying in that hospital bed, listening to my family talk as if my affairs were unresolved, I felt that same calm return. For the first time since being admitted, my chest loosened. The anxiety that had been building all day softened. They believed everything was uncertain, disorganized, open for discussion. They were wrong. The contrast between their assumptions and my reality steadied me. I thought about those sealed folders again, the care taken in every decision, about how preparation had never been about distrust, it had been about self-respect, about ensuring that no matter how others behaved, my intentions would stand without needing defense. That understanding brought clarity instead of bitterness. As machines hummed around me and footsteps passed outside the door, I realized something else. I wasn't afraid of what they might try to do, because they couldn't do anything that hadn't already been accounted for. The systems were in place. The boundaries were clear. I didn't need to explain them now. I didn't need to reveal anything. And then the thought came, sharp and steady. The one person who understood exactly why I had planned this way, the one person who knew every detail and every reason behind it, was about to walk through the door. Everything changed the moment the lawyer stepped into the room. Not because of what he said, but because of what he represented. He didn't rush. He didn't apologize for the interruption. He didn't soften his presence to match the mood. He entered with a calm certainty that immediately shifted the air, like a door closing behind him that couldn't be reopened. The hospital room, which had felt crowded with assumptions and quiet calculations, suddenly felt organized, contained. I noticed the change before anyone spoke. Chairs straightened, phones were put face down, conversations that had been flowing freely only moments earlier stopped mid-thought. My family's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough to be telling. Attention sharpened, eyes tracked movement. The casual confidence they had carried all day tightened into something more cautious, more alert. Whatever they thought this day was going to be, it had just taken a turn they hadn't planned for. I stayed still. I didn't sit up. I didn't explain. I didn't even look toward anyone for reaction. I watched instead, from the same position they had assumed made me powerless. Silence, I had learned, could be more revealing than confrontation. My breathing stayed even, measured. For the first time since being admitted, I felt no urgency to manage the room. The lawyer acknowledged me first, briefly and professionally, then turned his attention to the space itself. He didn't need to announce his purpose. His presence did that for him. Authority doesn't need volume. It settles in quietly and rearranges everything around it. The energy in the room shifted from speculation to awareness, from assumption to uncertainty. This was no casual visit. That realization moved through my family quickly, like a current. Questions formed behind their eyes before they were ever asked. They had expected discussions, perhaps disagreements, maybe even confusion they could guide. What they hadn't expected was structure. They hadn't expected preparation that didn't involve them. The lawyer's calm reframed the dynamic completely. The room was no longer centered on their interpretations of my condition or their plans for the future. It was centered on clarity, on process, on decisions already made. I could feel control returning to me, not in a loud or aggressive way, but in the only way that ever mattered, quietly, irrevocably. Years of being underestimated culminated in that moment. Not because I was proving something, but because I didn't need to. They had built an image of me that suited them, dependable, generous, unguarded, someone who handled problems but didn't create boundaries, someone who would defer, explain, accommodate. Watching that image begin to crack wasn't satisfying, it was grounding. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush of victory, no urge to look around and confirm that they understood what was happening. What I felt was steadiness, a sense that the ground beneath me was solid again. For the first time in days, my body felt secondary to my mind. I wasn't reacting, I was present. As the lawyer began to outline next steps, the tone remained neutral, professional, unemotional. That neutrality mattered. It stripped the situation of personal interpretation. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family dynamics. It was about legal reality, about intentions documented clearly and responsibly. The more he spoke, the quieter the room became. I noticed how often my family glanced toward me, searching for cues. Were they supposed to speak, object, agree? I gave them nothing. Silence became my strength. It was no longer the silence of being overlooked. It was the silence of someone who had already said everything that needed to be said, just not aloud. The lawyer's presence made it clear that whatever assumptions had been forming all day were incomplete, in some cases entirely wrong. This wasn't a discussion to be navigated through persuasion or emotional appeal. This was a framework that already existed, one they were only now being made aware of. That distinction unsettled them. I watched the realization take shape slowly. The confidence drained first, then the certainty. What replaced it was calculation, but it was too late for that to matter. You can't negotiate with preparation after the fact. You can only react to it, and reaction is always a weaker position. Control didn't return to me in a dramatic gesture. It returned through alignment, through the simple fact that someone else in the room understood my intentions better than anyone related to me by blood. Someone who had listened when I spoke in advance, not when circumstances forced the conversation. That understanding created a boundary no one else could cross. As documents were mentioned, I saw tension arise. Not panic yet, but awareness. The room felt smaller, tighter. The casual nature of earlier conversations vanished completely. Words were chosen carefully now. Questions were held back. No one wanted to reveal how much they had assumed. I stayed focused on the ceiling, on the steady rhythm of the machines, on my own breathing. This wasn't about watching reactions. It was about staying grounded in the decision I had made days, months, years earlier. Preparation had brought me here calmly. I wasn't about to undermine it with emotion. When the lawyer paused to organize materials, the silence stretched again, but it was different now. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't careless. It was heavy with recalibration. Everyone in that room was reassessing the story they had been telling themselves about me, about what I had done, about what I was capable of. And as documents were prepared and processes set in motion, I watched understanding dawn across their faces in fragments. The version of me they believed in, the passive provider, the endlessly available solution, no longer fit the reality unfolding in front of them. That story was wrong, and for the first time, they were beginning to realize it. It wasn't anger I felt as their confidence faded. It was distance. A quiet, measurable space opening between who they believed they were in relation to me and what the reality now demanded of them. I could feel it settle into the room, not as tension, but as recalibration. Something they had relied on without question was no longer reliable, and they didn't yet know how to stand without it. Their reactions unfolded slowly, almost politely. Confusion came first, small pauses after statements, glances exchanged without words, questions that started and then stopped. They were trying to locate the moment where they had lost the thread of control, the point at which their assumptions had stopped aligning with the situation. Disbelief followed, quieter but sharper. Not outrage, just the subtle refusal to fully accept what was being presented. There were no outbursts, no raised voices, no dramatic accusations. Instead, there was restraint, the kind people use when they realize they're being observed in a setting where emotion could work against them. Their composure stayed intact, but it was strained, like fabric pulled too tight. Each response was measured now, filtered through a new awareness that the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they'd thought. Their assumptions met reality without ceremony. What they believed was informal turned out to be formal. What they assumed was flexible was already defined. What they thought would be discussed had already been decided. The contrast was stark, but not humiliating. It was simply undeniable. Watching it happen felt less like witnessing a confrontation and more like watching a structure quietly lose its foundation. I observed everything without satisfaction. There was no sense of victory in me, no desire to savor their discomfort. That surprised me. I had expected at some level to feel justified or vindicated. Instead, I felt detached, as if the part of me that once needed recognition had already stepped away. Their reactions no longer felt personal. They felt procedural. That detachment protected me. It created a buffer between what was happening in the room and what I felt inside. I wasn't absorbing their confusion or adjusting myself to make them comfortable. I wasn't anticipating their needs or trying to smooth the moment. For the first time, I let them manage their own responses without my intervention. The power shift didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It moved quietly, through posture and tone. Chairs were pulled closer together, not in solidarity, but in strategy. Voices lowered, not out of respect, but caution. Conversations that once flowed freely now paused for consideration. Every word carried weight, and that weight changed how they held themselves. I noticed how often they looked toward the lawyer now instead of each other. Authority had moved. The center of gravity was no longer emotional or relational, it was structural, and by extension it was aligned with me. That alignment didn't feel empowering in the way I'd imagined it might. It felt stabilizing, like standing upright after years of leaning. Somewhere in that shift, I stopped feeling responsible for their feelings. The realization didn't arrive with guilt or conflict. It was simple and clean. Their confusion wasn't mine to resolve. Their disappointment wasn't mine to soften. I had spent a lifetime managing emotional fallout, absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to. That reflex didn't activate now. I saw the pattern breaking in real time. The familiar rhythm where they assumed I accommodated, where they expected I delivered, was gone. They reached instinctively for it, and it wasn't there. The absence was jarring. It left them without the usual cues, without the silent reassurance that I would adjust myself to fit whatever they needed next. That absence was where my peace began to form. Not loudly, not all at once. It started as a subtle release in my chest, a loosening I hadn't realized I was carrying. The constant internal monitoring, the awareness of others' needs, reactions, expectations quieted. I felt present in my own body again, not as a resource, but as a person. There was grief in that realization, too. Grief for how long the pattern had lasted, grief for how normal it had felt to disappear inside it. Watching entitlement collapse didn't bring joy, it brought understanding. And understanding has weight. It forces you to acknowledge not just what is ending, but what should never have been sustained for so long. The room felt different now, not tense, not calm, just altered, like a space that had been rearranged while no one was looking. The conversations that followed were careful, deliberate, stripped of assumption. Everyone was adjusting, recalculating their position in a story that had quietly changed direction. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because there was nothing left to explain. The clarity in the room didn't require my narration, it stood on its own. And in that clarity, I felt something I hadn't expected, an early sense of peace, fragile but real, forming beneath the surface. But clarity has a cost. As I watched them adapt to a reality they hadn't prepared for, I understood that relief wasn't the only emotion waiting for me. Sometimes seeing things clearly doesn't bring comfort. Sometimes it brings grief for what was lost and for what was never truly there to begin with. Losing the illusion of family hurt more than the illness ever did. The physical pain had been manageable, measurable, something doctors could track and treat. This was different. This grief had no chart, no timeline, no medication that could dull it. It arrived quietly, settled deep, and asked me to sit with truths I had avoided for most of my life. I grieved for what I believed our bond was, not what it actually looked like in that hospital room, but what I had carried in my mind for years. The version of family where loyalty flowed both ways, where care wasn't transactional, where love didn't require constant proof. That version had felt real to me. Letting go of it felt like losing something that had never truly existed, and that made the loss harder to name. Acceptance came slowly. I had to admit that love in my family had been conditional, not openly or maliciously, but quietly and consistently. It had been offered in exchange for stability, reliability, and sacrifice. As long as I fulfilled my role, I belonged. When I couldn't, the connection thinned. Seeing that pattern clearly didn't make me angry. It made me tired in a way rest couldn't fix. I began reflecting on where this dynamic came from.
Generational habits don't appear without history. I could see echoes of it in stories I'd heard growing up, in how obligation was framed as virtue, how endurance was praised more than honesty. Care was often expressed through duty, not presence. Needs were minimized, boundaries were treated like selfishness. I had inherited that framework without ever questioning whether it was healthy. With that understanding came the need to release guilt. Setting boundaries felt unfamiliar, almost wrong, as if I were withholding something I owed. I had to unlearn the belief that protecting myself meant abandoning others. Emotional honesty required me to stop blaming myself for dynamics I hadn't created alone. I hadn't forced anyone to depend on me without regard for my limits. I had simply participated, believing it was love. At night, the hospital window reflected more of the room than the world outside. The darkness beyond the glass felt vast and quiet, a contrast to the steady activity inside. I watched the city lights flicker in the distance and thought about how many nights I had spent awake worrying about everyone else. That stillness gave me space to finally feel what I'd been suppressing. Not rage, not resentment, but sorrow. Kindness without limits, I realized, invites harm. Not because kindness is wrong, but because without boundaries it becomes something others can rely on without accountability. I had mistaken endurance for strength, and in doing so I had taught people how to overlook me. Understanding that didn't erase the hurt, but it gave it context. It allowed me to see my role without condemning myself. My sense of self-worth began to shift. I no longer measured it by how useful I was, how much I could give, or how smoothly I could manage crises. Worth didn't have to be earned through sacrifice. It could exist on its own, quiet and steady. That realization felt fragile at first, like something that might disappear if I didn't hold it carefully. But it stayed. Healing didn't come with declarations or dramatic moments. It began internally, in the way I spoke to myself, in the way I allowed sadness without rushing to fix it. I didn't need my family to acknowledge what had happened for me to move forward. I didn't need an apology, an explanation, or a promise to do better. Wanting those things would have kept me tied to expectations that no longer served me. As the nights passed, the grief softened into something more manageable. It didn't vanish, but it stopped overwhelming me. I could think clearly again. I could imagine a future not shaped around obligation or guilt, a future where peace wasn't something I earned by giving everything away, but something I protected by knowing when to stop. And once I stopped hoping they would change, once I released the need for them to become a version of family they had never shown themselves to be, clarity arrived. In that quiet understanding, I finally knew what I needed to do next. Recovery didn't begin when my body healed. It began when I stopped trying to earn my place. That realization settled in slowly, but once it did, it changed how I saw everything that followed. I understood then that closeness without respect was not connection, and presence without care was not love. What I needed wasn't to be surrounded, it was to be safe, emotionally and mentally, in my own life. The emotional separation solidified without drama. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no final conversation meant to clear the air. I simply stopped leaning in. I stopped anticipating reactions. I stopped shaping myself around what might keep the peace. The distance didn't feel cold or vengeful. It felt necessary, like stepping back from something that had been quietly draining me for years. Boundaries, once tentative, became permanent, not rigid or harsh, but firm. I no longer left space for interpretation or negotiation. My time, my energy, my decisions were no longer communal property. I didn't justify them. I didn't soften them to make them easier for others to accept.
Boundaries stopped being something I felt guilty about and became something I relied on. I also stopped over-explaining. That habit had been deeply ingrained, the urge to clarify, reassure, and provide context so no one felt uncomfortable. Letting go of it felt strange at first, like leaving a sentence unfinished, but the silence that followed was revealing. The people who respected me didn't need explanations. The ones who demanded them had been relying on access I was no longer offering. In that space, I began redefining what family and connection meant to me. It wasn't about blood or history alone. It was about mutual regard, about relationships where presence didn't require performance and care wasn't conditional. I allowed myself to imagine a smaller, quieter circle, one built on respect rather than obligation. That idea felt both unfamiliar and deeply relieving. Planning for the future took on a different tone. For the first time, my plans weren't shaped around contingency for others. They were centered on peace, on sustainability, on a life that didn't require constant self-neglect to function. I thought about where I wanted to live, how I wanted my days to feel, what kind of pace allowed me to breathe. Those questions had been deferred for so long that answering them felt like meeting myself again. Financial clarity played a larger role than I expected. Knowing exactly where things stood, what was protected, and how decisions would be honored brought a sense of emotional freedom I hadn't anticipated. Money had never been about control for me. It had been about responsibility. Now, that responsibility was finally aligned with self-respect. There was comfort in knowing that my future wasn't open to reinterpretation. There was no revenge in any of this, no desire to teach lessons or make statements. I didn't announce my decisions or explain my reasoning. I didn't need anyone to understand. Peace didn't require witnesses. The absence of drama was intentional. It kept the focus where it belonged, on forward movement, not reaction. Morning light began to feel different. When it streamed through the hospital window, it didn't feel like an interruption. It felt like permission. Clean air through a cracked window reminded me that not everything had to be heavy or complicated. There was space ahead of me, quiet space. And for the first time, that quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt open. Empowerment came through quiet independence, through knowing that I could choose distance without bitterness, clarity without cruelty. I didn't need validation to feel whole. I didn't need agreement to move on. My sense of self no longer depended on being needed or approved of. It rested on something steadier, self-trust. As my strength returned and discharge plans were discussed, I noticed how calm I felt. There was no anxiety about what waited for me outside the hospital walls, no dread about stepping back into old roles. I knew those roles were no longer available to me, and that knowledge brought relief instead of fear. By the time I packed my things, folded the blanket one last time, and looked around the room that had revealed so much, I understood the truth fully. I wasn't leaving a place of recovery. I was leaving a threshold. And by the time I walked out of the hospital, I wasn't walking back into my old life. I left the hospital lighter, not because I was cured, but because I was finally free. The weight that had pressed on me for years hadn't come from illness alone. It had come from obligation, from unspoken expectations, from the quiet pressure to keep being everything for everyone else. Walking out of that building, I felt the difference immediately. My body was still healing, but my mind had already crossed a line it would never return from. Looking back, I could see the journey with more clarity than pain. What happened in that hospital room wasn't a breaking point, it was a revealing point. It stripped away distractions and habits and left only truth behind. I had spent so long defining myself through usefulness that I hadn't noticed how much of myself I was losing in the process. The illness hadn't taken anything from me. It had given me sight. I stopped thinking of what happened as punishment. There was no lesson meant to shame me, no consequence for being too kind or too available. It was a catalyst, a forced pause that made reflection unavoidable. Without it, I might have continued moving forward on the same path, slowly diminishing without ever naming what was happening. Sometimes the body interrupts the mind when the mind refuses to listen. My family remained unchanged, and I made peace with that. I no longer needed them to understand or agree with the choices I had made. I didn't need acknowledgement or remorse to validate my experience. Expecting change from them would have kept me tied to the same cycle, measuring progress by their reactions instead of my own peace. Letting go of that expectation felt like setting something heavy down after carrying it for too long. I reclaimed authorship of my life, quietly. There was no declaration, no moment where I announced a new beginning. It happened internally, in the way I made decisions without checking how they might be received, in the way I chose rest without guilt, in the way I allowed myself to prioritize what felt right over what felt expected. The story of my life no longer needed their approval to continue. Legacy began to look different to me. It wasn't about how much I gave or how much I endured. It wasn't about being remembered as the one who held everything together at personal cost. It became about self-respect, about leaving behind clarity instead of confusion, about knowing that what I built with intention. And what I protected because it mattered to me. The image that stayed with me was simple: doors closing. Not slammed, not locked, just closed. Keys resting in my hand, warm from being held, familiar and solid. Those keys represented access, choice, and ownership. I didn't owe anyone entry anymore. I could decide what stayed open and what didn't, without explanation. Peace replaced obligation in ways I hadn't expected. I slept more deeply. My thoughts slowed. I noticed things again: the sound of morning, the rhythm of my own breath, the comfort of quiet moments that weren't filled with anticipation of someone else's needs. Peace wasn't dramatic. It was steady. It held. Moving forward didn't require confidence in the traditional sense. I didn't feel invincible or triumphant. What I felt was grounded, a quiet confidence rooted in knowing myself better than I ever had before. I trusted my judgment now, not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. That trust made all the difference. Closure didn't come through confrontation. There was no final conversation that wrapped everything up neatly. Closure came through acceptance, through choosing not to revisit or reopen what had already been understood. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need the last word. Walking away with clarity was enough. As time passed, the hospital became a memory instead of a wound. The room that once felt like a place of erasure became the place where everything finally came into focus. I didn't romanticize it. I didn't resent it either. It simply marked the moment when I stopped confusing endurance with love and silence with strength. I moved forward with dignity because I no longer needed to be seen to feel real. My worth wasn't dependent on being acknowledged or included. It existed independently, quietly, and fully. That understanding reshaped how I carried myself in the world. I was no longer trying to earn space. I was choosing where to stand. They may never understand why things changed. They may interpret my distance in ways that protect their own narratives. I let them. Their interpretations were no longer my responsibility. What mattered was that I knew the truth, and I honored it. I walked away with my name intact, not as a role, not as a resource, not as an expectation, but as a person. Someone who learned, chose, and protected themselves when it mattered most. That choice didn't make me hard, it made me whole. They thought my silence meant weakness, but it was the strongest decision I ever made. This story began in a hospital room. But it truly ended the moment I chose myself. When I stopped speaking, my life finally spoke for me. The people who mistook my silence for weakness never understood it was my strongest boundary. I walked forward without arguments, without revenge, and without looking back. Some relationships stayed behind, but my identity moved on with me. And sometimes, the greatest victory is simply leaving with yourself intact. If this story made you pause, think, or see someone in your life a little differently, pass it along to someone who might need it too. These are the kinds of stories that mean more when they're shared quietly, not loudly. And if you want more real human stories like this, ones that don't shout but stay with you, you know where to find them next time. Before you go, here's something I'm genuinely curious about. Where are you watching from right now? And what made this story resonate with you?